So welcome to the Chappaqua Library Foreign Policy Discussion Group. We're now in our 23rd year of bringing you live experts in foreign policy to help us understand what's going on in the world and how it affects the United States. This is our third of the season. The last one that we had was back in September. It seems like a long time ago. In any way, we present these generally every other Monday through December 18th. All of our programs are recorded for on-demand viewing, and they can be accessed on the Chappaqua Library website. So I am June Blanc. I would also like to introduce my colleagues. Maybe they wave. Tyler Beebe, Naomi Marrow, Peter Russell, and our two new members, Amy Friedman and Carolyn Resnick. So today we now turn our attention to Europe and who are the thought leaders in Europe today. At our last meeting, we heard from Sarwar Kashmiri from the Atlantic Council about NATO and how it is as important as ever, particularly now as Russia is looming a threat to Europe. At the same time, U.S. is trying to balance its threats from China and also around Hezbollah. And so it's a time when the United States is hoping that Europe will also become less dependent on the United States and free it to look at other threats across the world. And yet at the same time, Europe seems not always a somewhat reluctant partner. And so anyway, we want to introduce you and welcome Bart. Okay, now I'm going to have problems. Szewczyk from the German Marshall Plan to help us understand the challenges that Europe is facing internally and coming forth with a unified voice and plan and leadership and where leadership is coming elsewhere. As always, we invite your questions, which you can enter in the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. This discussion group will lead the questions and then leave time for questions for our viewers. So let me introduce you to our host, Peter Russell, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning, all. We're really pleased to have Bart Szewczyk speak with us this morning. He's an amazing policy and scholar who has worked a lot on security, European defense issues, and it's so timely right now because Europe is facing a lot of enormous challenges, as June mentioned. Bart is a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He's an adjunct professor at Sciences or Sciences Po in Paris. He's a former member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff. He also served as advisor on refugee policy to the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And he's the author of a recent book, Grand Strategy, Navigating a New World Order. He has an associate, he's been an associate research scholar at Columbia University Law School. He holds a PhD in international relations from Cambridge, a JD from Yale Law School, an MPA from Princeton, and a bachelor's in science and economics from University of Pennsylvania. He's also clerked at the International Court of Justice and to one of the justices at the U.S. Appeals Court, 3rd District. So we're really pleased to have Bart at this moment. If some of you do want to look at the German Marshall Fund site, or one of the things that caught our eye and brought us to invite Bart was an article he wrote in July, had published, Who Will Fill Europe's Leadership Vacuum? And that followed an earlier article which touched on another aspect of Europe's challenge right now. That was an article back in April, U.S. Grand Strategy, Making and Unmaking. So one of the challenges for Europe ahead of us is what happens in the election in the coming week, because you have an incumbent president and vice president who have worked very hard to reinforce our alliances, particularly with Europe. And we have another president who has tried to degrade those at every opportunity. So Bart, thank you for being with us. I just want to remind everyone that Bart has a hard stop time at 11 o'clock. He'll have 20, 30 minutes as he likes to speak with us, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions. Thank you, Bart.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you, June, as well, for the very kind introduction. And it's a delight to speak with you today at a very charged moment in European history as well as transatlantic relations. Obviously, everyone is waiting with high anticipation for the results of the US presidential elections in a couple of weeks. But there are also lots of things taking place in Europe in the meantime, and I'll take a few minutes today with you to provide a general overview of what's happening, what people are thinking about, planning, and who the key players are, and so forth. So, as Peter kindly flagged, I published an article a few months ago on kind of the general trajectory of where things are heading in Europe in foreign policy. And this was in the aftermath of Europe's elections, which took place in June of this year. And just to give you kind of a quick background on how the European Union institutions are structured and who gets picked how, because it can be a little bit of a complex and Byzantine system. In a nutshell, we've had elections for the European Parliament. The European Parliament is the legislature for the European Union and is the only democratically elected institution out of the various EU institutions. It has 700 plus members of the European Parliament, so a little bit larger than the US Congress and Senate put together, representing about 400 million plus European citizens across 27 countries. So in June, early June, 4th, 5th, and 6th, you had elections just like we will have in the United States in a couple of weeks, organized by each of the 27 member states and EU citizens. Any national of a new member state gets to vote in these elections for the European Parliament, went to vote and selected a member for the European Parliament. Now, those members started, and these are maybe elections which aren't as popular as national elections, but they still get relatively good voter turnout. I think for this past year, it was something around 60% or something like this. So, a decent showing. So in any event, these 700 plus members of the European Parliament started in late June. And at the same time, what you have is selection, and this is not by democratic electoral vote, but by sort of appointment or selection by governments of key leaders of the other institutions. So the other key institution, in addition to the European Parliament, the equivalent sort of the US Congress, is the European Commission. Now, the European Commission is kind of a quirky body. It's sort of the executive branch of the European Union, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. But let's just say sort of the executive branch, the government of the European Union. And that branch, the European Commission, is headed by a president of the European Commission, currently Ursula von der Leyen. Now, the way the president of the European Commission gets selected is by vote or nomination by each of the 27 EU member states, each of the 27 EU governments. So, in practice, France, French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, Polish Prime Minister Tusk, and so on and so forth. And they meet, the 27 of them, and agree on a nominee, as it were, for the president of the European Commission. and they nominated again Ursula von der Leyen, who was president of the European Commission for the previous 5 years. Now, just because they nominate doesn't automatically make her president. She had to get confirmed by the European Parliament, by the new 700 plus MEPs. And that took place, I believe, sometime that took place actually in mid-July. It happened relatively quickly. And it took place by majority vote. So far, so good. We had 700 plus new MEPs, the same president of the European Commission renominated and confirmed by the European Parliament. And then the other mix of the European institutions and leaders that needs to be appointed and selected is the so-called foreign minister of the EU, the high representative for foreign affairs and security policy. And this is the former Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas. And she, again, had to be nominated by the 27 EU member states, the governments, and she needs to be now confirmed by the parliament. Her hearing will be coming up shortly after the US presidential elections in mid-November. And to fill out the ranks, there are two other presidents, just to make it a little bit more complicated. There's the president of the European Parliament itself, Roberta Metsola from Malta. She was president before, and she was reappointed or re-elected by the parliament to serve in her current role again. And finally, there's the president of the European Council. Now, the European Council is a body that brings together all the EU national government leaders. So people like Macron, Scholz, the president of France, Chancellor of Germany, Prime Minister of Poland, Prime Minister of Italy, of Spain, and so on and so forth. And they select a president to help coordinate their meetings and set their agenda, negotiate deals, and so forth. This is kind of a person who's supposed to be the honest broker in the meetings. And finally, you have each member state, each of the 27 member states, nominate a commissioner designate to serve in the European Commission, to fill out the ranks of the executive branch. This is sort of like, von der Leyen's cabinet, or if von der Leyen is the equivalent to the US president, let's say, this is the commissioner designates are, the equivalents of the Secretary of Treasury, Agriculture, and so on and so forth. And so you have each of the 27 EU member states nominate one commissioner, and they get allocated various portfolios, again, trade, home affairs, agriculture, economics, defense, and so on and so forth. And these commissioner designates now need to be confirmed by the parliament. So I hope I haven't lost you thus far, but it is a relatively complicated structure, and it's useful to just lay it out in terms of who is the new team, as it were, in Brussels at the European Union. And some of it is old, sort of experienced individuals, and some of it is newcomers who are fresh to the EU. In terms of the returning individuals, you have Ursula von der Leyen as president of the European Commission, Roberta Metsola, president of the European Parliament, the newcomers, HRVP, Kaja Kallas from Estonia, in charge of foreign affairs, and also the council president, Antonio Costa, who's the former Portuguese leader. And so they are now kind of finalizing their transition process. Again, confirmation of the commissioner designates, and that should be completed by mid-November. It might get delayed depending on whether the parliament decides to vote against any of the commissioner designates. And typically, the way these things work is that the parliament likes to flex its muscles and show that they're not going to approve whoever the member states nominate. And so typically there are, one or two candidates who get voted down just as a show of force by the parliament. And that might delay the confirmation process of everyone. And in any event, the new team is likely to start either beginning of December, or if things get delayed, beginning of January. Now, that's sort of in terms of personnel, and it's important to pay attention to the individual personalities, because as the old saying goes, personnel is policy. Now, what is this new team like? Generally, von der Leyen, she is now quite experienced. This is her second 5-year mandate, and she's gone through a number of crises, which she's managed relatively effectively. Nothing's perfect, but the overall record has been better than may have been expected during COVID, and now, most importantly, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So she's been relatively strong on both issues and is likely to carry this forward. Kaja Kallas from Estonia is also quite forceful on Ukraine and Russian issues. And the rest of the team should be pretty good as well. Now, as I flag in my article and also in one of my books, the important thing to know or to keep in the back of one's mind when one thinks about European policymaking, especially in the area of foreign policy, is that, it's a complex system. There are a lot of people who have a say, or at least have some role in the decision-making process. And so the way things get done isn't by, any single person driving the agenda or deciding, because it doesn't work that way. It's not a hierarchical system like the US government, where the president, at least in the area of foreign policy, ultimately decides. The way things work in Europe is that it's a team-oriented process. You've got, the president of the European Commission, the HRVP, president of the European Council, and then, very importantly, each of the European leaders, each of the heads of state and government in the national capitals, that also have a say in how things are decided and what gets pushed ahead or what does not. And so, in addition to thinking about the new leaders in Brussels, one also has to look at the national leaders, in particular leaders or heads of state and government in the big EU member states. Predominantly, people have sort of focused traditionally on France and Germany, because those two countries have been at the forefront of EU policymaking and decision-making writ large over the past several decades, and going back to the beginnings of the European communities and then the European Union. And there, the situation is a little bit more bleak than, let's say, the relatively good assessment of the personnel at the EU level, because in France, President Macron suffered a major defeat at these European parliamentary elections. His party, I think, came in third out of the various national parties that were vying for positions in the European Parliament. And he immediately, based on that poor showing, decided to dissolve his parliament, his National Assembly, and call for snap new elections. It's a prerogative of the French president to do. And he wanted to show that the European elections didn't necessarily reflect his popularity domestically, and it was his test case to show that he still commanded a majority, and that turned out not to be the case. He suffered a pretty significant defeat in the national elections in France, lost his government, and the new government that's been formed relatively recently is sort of a collection of a bunch of compromises. So it is headed up by a prime minister from the Conservative Party, the one of the parties that is not it's outside of Macron's party, but the key sort of kingmakers, as it were, in selecting the new government was the far right party, headed by Marine Le Pen, and she was basically the one deciding whether this new French government was going to be approved or not. So what, if you think about it in US terms, it's as if Kamala Harris won the presidency, but then in selecting the cabinet, it was actually, headed up by someone picked by Donald Trump, right? And so it makes it for and so if you think about, let's say, Kamala Harris having to work with, J.D. Vance as Secretary of State, and maybe Eric Trump as Secretary of Treasury or something like this, that would make it for a very complicated process of decision making in the US context. And that is basically what is happening right now in France. And it essentially hampers what the French government can do and what French President Macron can do. And so as a consequence, he is much weaker. His position is a lot weaker now than it was, let's say, in May of this year. Likewise, in Berlin, Chancellor Scholz, like Macron, suffered a pretty bad electoral defeat in the European parliamentary elections. I think, as I recall, the far right party in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, had a better showing in the European parliamentary elections than each of the coalition parties in the German government. Right now, the German government is a coalition of 3 different parties. And so the far right party did better than any of the 3 individual coalition government parties. And so, again, if you're a leader of a government coming out of an electoral result like this, your freedom of maneuver and your ability to persuade and to drive policy and so forth is heavily constrained. Germany will have to hold its own elections in about 12 months' time in the fall of next year. And so, the German government can still get things done because, in contrast to France, there's no internal friction or division between or balance of power between conflicting parties. But politically, it is a little bit of a lame duck government, and everyone is expecting Scholz to suffer massive electoral defeat next year and probably be replaced by the Christian Democrats, by Friedrich Merz. So if you think about European decision making as a team sport, and 2 of the leading captains, your main quarterback and your main wide receiver are basically out with massive injuries, it's difficult to kind of drive the ball down the field. And so the question that I asked in the article, and people are asking around in Europe, is can anyone else pick up the pieces? And as bad as the European elections were for some of the main power centers like Paris and Berlin, Warsaw, in contrast, did very well. So the party of Prime Minister Tusk in Poland was able to get more votes in the European parliamentary elections than it did the previous time around 5 years ago. And, coming out of successful elections of that type, he incidentally was elected into office in October of last year and finally came into office in December. And after being out of power for about 9 years, he was prime minister before. And so in a way, the way to think about Tusk is sort of like the Biden team with maybe a younger President Biden, or at least, a more overall energetic team, but with equal experience. That's the main thing to remember about the Tusk government, because they were in power 10 years ago. They did a relatively good job when they were in power, and they brought the same people as prime minister, foreign minister, and then some fresh faces. But like the Biden team, when they came into office 4 years ago, these guys, these men and women know what they are doing, and they know how to get things done. And they've, hit the ground running over the past now 10, 11 months. And one thought I had and presented in the article and shopped around town in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe is whether Warsaw, could be the star quarterback, whether it could be the, whether it could help drive the ball forward, sort of be the Tom Brady equivalent. And time will tell. Time will tell. When I ask various German or French officials, they say, no way. We appreciate Poland's contribution, but we lead. We like to lead, and we will continue to lead. When I ask other European officials, they're more open to the idea, but it's one thing to announce that you're going to be the leader, and it's another thing to have other people follow you. So that sort of rounds out the overall state of play of kind of the personnel and sources of leadership in Europe. And as you probably imagine, there's a pretty long agenda in terms of issues to address. And let me maybe tackle some of those before turning to your questions. So the number 1, 2, and 3 issue on Europe's agenda continues to be Ukraine and Russia's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. As you know, it's been ongoing for over 2.5 years, since February of 2022. Now with around 1 million casualties resulting from the war on both sides, mostly military casualties, but a high number of civilian casualties as well. Now, these are deaths as well as injuries. Billions upon hundreds of billions in terms of wartime destruction. Huge economic costs in Europe in terms of Europe redirecting its energy imports from Russia to other sources. Europe having to provide for refugee protection for about 5 million Ukrainian refugees at a cost of, at this point, over $100 billion. These sums add up quite a bit when you're talking about the scale of war involved here. Weapons supplies and financial aid to Ukraine on the order of over $200 billion. And without a clear end to the conflict. Now, it's been going on for 2.5 years. The longer conflict has been going on since 2014, as you well know as well. And it's anyone's guess when it will be over. Now, some people, including the Polish Foreign Minister, Szewczyk, who knows a thing or two about fighting the Russians because he was a journalist when he was in his 20s in Afghanistan, covering the Mujahideen fight against the Soviets in the 80s. And, he estimates that this war could last another 10 years. And it's not impossible if you look at modern conflicts and how long they last in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so forth. These things tend to percolate for quite a number of years because it's difficult for either side to impose its terms on the other. Now, if you think about, another 8-10 years of this type of conflict, even if you have periodic ceasefires and so forth, that is a lot of casualties, several million casualties, trillions of dollars in damage, probably trillion plus in terms of weapon supplies and financial aid and so forth. These are huge sums, huge sums. And so that is why this is the focus for all European leaders at this point. And they've managed a relatively decent response thus far, both in terms of imposing sanctions against Russia, redirecting energy supplies away from Russia, coming up with the money to fund Ukraine, coming up with some of the weapons to send to Ukraine, and providing for refugee protection. But the key element in the wider Western response with respect to the war in Ukraine has been the United States. It's been the weapons flowing from the United States, the intelligence flowing from the United States, political leadership flowing from Washington. And so the US role has been really central and indispensable, and it will be very, very difficult to replace. So maybe let me just offer a few closing reflections on the US and where things might go depending on who's in office, and then I'll open up to questions. So if it's Kamala Harris, she is likely to, as you probably know well as well, continue the main lines of policy right now, most importantly, continuing the flow of weapons to Ukraine. These are tanks and ammunition and self-propelled howitzers, missiles, planes, and other rocket launch systems and so forth. And so she would like to continue that effort, continue the financial aid, and continue the coordination with allies and partners. As Peter mentioned, this is sort of part of the inner logic of the administration, of her team, that even for a big superpower like the United States, with a quarter of the world's GDP, it's important to have allies and partners to help with addressing any global challenges. Now, having said that, she is probably also going to chart her own course. It's a little bit more difficult for her to draw clear lines of difference with President Biden because, as you know, there's a sacred principle in U.S. Government, under the U.S. constitutional system of one president at a time. Not a principle that it isn't violated periodically by people like Donald Trump, but nonetheless, that is something that someone like Kamala Harris is very sensitive to and does not want to draw clear lines with President Biden at the same time that the president and his team are trying to negotiate some de-escalation process in the Middle East, or convene a summit in Germany to provide for additional aid and weapons for Ukraine. So that is just sort of the constraints of her being a sitting vice president. But to be sure, if she, and hopefully she will be, from my vantage point at least, president, then she would chart her own course. Her team would chart their own course, and she might choose, various different courses of action, different steps than President Biden. Her national security advisor, Phil Gordon, is a seasoned European hand. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe under the Obama-Biden administration in the first couple of years, and knows the region very well. But of course, ultimately she's the president, he would be the advisor, and if he were to be selected for that role, and so she would decide exactly how to prioritize support for Europe and Ukraine relative to other issues. Now, if it's Donald Trump in office, then it's a little bit more unpredictable. His second term would likely to be similar to the first term in terms of being a little bit, chaotic, disorganized, and erratic and arbitrary. And it could go one of several ways. So one option is game over for Ukraine, as one European official told me recently, which is that Donald Trump would cut off US weapon supplies to Ukraine and seek a direct negotiation with Vladimir Putin over the heads of Europe or Ukraine. And it's something that, is within Donald Trump's prerogative and discretion if he were to become president. And he could certainly cut off weapons supplies, and he could certainly try to negotiate with Putin. Now, even if he tried those things, there's a question whether he'll be able to execute on those intentions. And maybe he would get pressure from the Congress or from the Republican Party or from the wider public to continue the weapons supplies, or maybe he, would have several calls with Putin or meetings with Putin and realize that there's not much to negotiate, and so the whole thing would unravel. But certainly, it's something that he could pursue. I think that's not necessarily the most likely option, maybe 25% chance, but it's not a 0% option as well. Probably from my vantage point, if Trump were to be president, the most likely option is that he would continue the weapons supplies, but have Europeans and other countries pay for these weapons supplies. And then the big political victory would be, selling $100 billion of weapons to Ukraine and having someone else pay for it. And that this would be the big political win. And he could do that. The question is whether Europe would pay for it, and my sense is that it probably would. And then, the question would be what would be Russia's response, and whether if Russia were to escalate, what would be the response on the U.S. side. And then finally, the third option, and I would put this middle category in the 50% bucket. And then finally, a third option would be, basically everything and nothing, a little bit of a mishmash of various policies, and without any clear commitment, without any clear goals, and kind of an up and down situation. Either way, it'll be a more difficult slog for Ukraine. It'll be a more difficult situation for Europe. But certainly, these options would be on the table. So hopefully we'll know by November 6th what the result is in the U.S. elections at the very least, and then we'll see where things go in Europe and beyond. So I'll pause here and see if you have any questions, and if you don't, I'm happy to continue rambling for another few minutes. But I'll stop here for the time being.
Thank you, Bart, for that survey of the scene. I'd like to ask you a first question, coming back to the setting you gave us of the 27 member states trying to take on big tasks together. And you illustrated through the leadership selection how difficult it is to get decisions, or takes time. Meanwhile, the challenges facing Europe really are serious, and in the defense and security side, it's being able to coordinate supplies and production and force measures. So my question is, are there other sources beyond the ones you mentioned, France, Germany, Poland? And for example, is there any prospect for kind of smaller leadership coalitions to come together, perhaps with the Baltics or the Scandinavians? And related to that, we saw in the case of the formation of the European Commission that the Italian leader Meloni had a big voice, and she has kind of walked the middle path, I think, in terms of being more supportive of NATO and the EU. And my third part of that is, we've seen just recently UK leaders meeting with senior European leaders. And in the area of defense, will Europe work more with the UK?
Yeah, all great questions. Look, in terms of your immediate point about other sources of leadership on issues such as weapons supplies and so forth, on the issue of weapons supplies, it's a complicated matter because the main problem in Europe is that Europe doesn't have sufficient manufacturing base to produce the 155 millimeter ammunition, the tanks and the missiles, and so on and so forth, that a full-scale war like the one in Ukraine requires. And you'd be surprised to know that even 2.5 years into it, things have only improved on the margins, and that is because all these all this manufacturing is done on a national basis. So basically, you have to think about, okay, you have a company in France, and they, procure or they sell to the French government, and will produce whatever the French government procures from them on a long-term basis. And that's also the case for Sweden and Italy and Germany and Spain. And that's where the main companies, the main defense companies are, but they look to their national capitals for guidance in terms of what is required. Poland, for its part, has a ton of defense needs, but they import most of their weapon systems, primarily from the United States, but also now from South Korea. And they signed a $15 billion contract 2 years ago with South Korea to procure self-propelled howitzers and tanks and missiles and planes. Now, so for an issue like, let's say delivering 1 million rounds of 155 ammunition to the Ukrainian front lines, which is basically what they need, there's insufficient manufacturing capacity in Europe. So the main source has been either the United States or South Korea, who has provided a lot of the weapons either directly to specific member states like Poland or through the United States to the Ukrainian front line. So, you can have great kind of leadership and interesting ideas and interesting personalities put forth good ideas to try to move things ahead. But the problem is that, these things are still done on a national basis. There's insufficient manufacturing capacity in Europe, and the whole continent is really reliant on the United States to provide a lot of the weapon systems and to sort of build up capacity to produce more. Now, people are trying to find workarounds. So, for instance, there's a German company, Rheinmetall, that produces a lot of the ammunition and tanks for the German market. It partnered, and this, I don't know exactly why this turned out to be this way, but they partnered with a company all the way in Australia at the end of the world to produce more ammunition for the Ukrainian front line to then ship back to Europe and deliver to the Ukrainian front line. I have no idea why, they're going to Australia rather than Australian manpower and material and so forth coming to Germany or Poland to produce more of this stuff here. Maybe it has something to do with regulatory hurdles or something like this. But in any event, people are trying to find workarounds. And the truth is that it's a complicated decision-making process. But if something is feasible, sort of realistically, if there's stuff, if there are production lines and if there are manufacturing plants and so forth out there to mobilize, then the political system can do its part. The one example I offer, which illustrates the point that, across the 27 different member states with different parties and so on and so forth, and then you have the complicated EU decision-making process, they still get a budget approved every year, and they negotiate a 7-year so-called multi-annual financial framework to have ranges of budgets for each of these years, and they still get it done. We haven't had a budget in I don't know, maybe since the Clinton administration or something like this. And so now we have our own workarounds, but just to illustrate the point that stuff can get done if notwithstanding the complexity. Now, Meloni is interesting because you're right. She was viewed as kind of a queen maker, kingmaker in her own right, because her party, the sort of the far right, the far right party in the European Parliament did better than expected. But in fact, either she misplayed her hands or she was outmaneuvered by sort of the centrist parties. people thought that she would have a greater sway on the appointment process of the individual commissioners, or that Italy would get a very big portfolio, but it turned out not to be the case. So somehow her position in a way was, she underplayed her hand given the electoral results. And, ultimately going forward, it's right now things are in a little bit of wait and see mode, because the US elections are upon us within a couple of weeks in any event. And obviously things will be a lot easier for Europe, at least if it's a Kamala Harris administration. And if it's Donald Trump, people have gone through that movie before as well, and so they'll have various measures in response. There was an article today that there are all sorts of retaliatory trade measures being contemplated of EU tariffs if they face the Trump 10% and plus tariffs on the US side. And so people will try to deal with it, but the biggest problem would be this issue of US of filling the gap of US weapon supplies to Ukraine if those are cut off. And if that happens, that would put Ukraine first and foremost in a very difficult position, as well as the rest of Europe.
So Bart, I want to turn it over to some of the other panelists for a question. Who's up first? Tyler?
Yes, thanks. Bart, thank you very much for a comprehensive review. I was wondering, what do you feel is the internal view at the highest level within Europe, the key countries involved, about NATO? Is it viewed as a sufficiently cohesive, militarily capable organization that knows what it's doing? Or if you read some commentary, that it's basically pretty disorganized and each country has its own military operations and focus, and there's a lot of inefficiency in weapon systems, etc., and that if push comes to shove, it could not or may not do a sufficient job of countering the Russians in Ukraine. Is there a feeling that there's vulnerability within NATO? And given the fact that the defense of European countries really comes through our connection with NATO. In other words, we don't have any, I think it's correct, any direct defense agreements with, Britain or France or Germany. So whatever happens in terms of defending Europe, it's going to come via our connection with NATO.
Right. No, great question. And it also brought to mind Peter's third question about the role of the British. And let me just address that briefly, which is people are very excited about the new British team. And David Lammy, the foreign secretary, was in town, I think last week or maybe a couple of weeks ago, to attend the Foreign Affairs Council, and was very warmly greeted. He, is a very engaging person, great speaker, great thinker. And so people are really excited about him and the Prime Minister Starmer as well. But in terms of overcoming these hurdles in the defense manufacturing base that I highlighted, I think there'll be some real constraints in terms of getting more things done than exists currently, because these are still national programs, national budget lines, and so forth. And so one could imagine some potential cooperative schemes between the UK and Germany and France and Poland. And the British government has been signing a number of treaties with Germany and France to promote greater cooperation. But I've talked to a lot of people, and they're a little skeptical as to how much progress can be made, because ultimately these things will be determined by national priorities, and each country will want to preserve a certain level of national control. Now, in terms of NATO, NATO is viewed pretty well and is the greatest military alliance in history, and with good reason. And it's internally unified. It's got pre-positioned troops and equipment on the eastern flank, and the machinery is working relatively well. And ultimately, NATO would continue to work well so long as there's a strong US commitment to NATO. And that is the sine qua non of NATO's effectiveness, because in a nutshell, the way to think about NATO is sort of like the UN, which the late Richard Holbrooke described the UN as, sort of like, he said, if people blame the UN or praise the UN for something, it's as if blaming or praising the Madison Square Garden for the way the New York Knicks play. It's not the forum, it's not the UN, it's not NATO, it's the players, meaning the individual countries, America, Great Britain, France, Germany, and so forth. And so the question is, are those players effective? And NATO is a formidable force so long as the US is at the forefront of it, because all this. It's the US that has a huge nuclear arsenal that can credibly deter Russia's huge nuclear arsenal. And through decades of Cold War and post-Cold War experience, we've managed various arrangements and understandings where the Russians are not going to use their nukes because you have the US nuclear umbrella across the Western alliance. If somehow that is undermined, or if, let's say, Trump pulls out of NATO, as he's insinuated a couple of times, then NATO is not the same NATO anymore. It's a hollowed shell, and it probably doesn't continue to exist, or at least not in any effective way. Now, there is, even with the US, even with the Biden administration or with Kamala Harris continuing the general lines of policy, NATO does face some kind of logistical issues in terms of reinforcing Europe in the event of war with Russia. And there is an issue, and I'm not a sort of a detailed military expert, so I won't be able to tell you exactly, how soon the front lines could be reinforced. But there is sort of a question of timeliness and how many divisions you could be able to deploy to Europe in the event of conflict, and to ensure that in the first place the conflict doesn't arise, because you're deterring Russians because they know that you would arrive ahead of them. And so because there is that ambiguity, whether it's 2 weeks or several weeks, and how quickly you can kind of amass the alliance's military strength on the front line, that is one gap that NATO does have, that people are aware of, and they're trying to fill. But other than that, the alliance is pretty effective, which is why you had countries like Sweden and Finland dying to get in the second that Russia invaded Ukraine, because they wanted to ultimately have the backstop guarantee that Article 5 and NATO provide. But ultimately, NATO is basically nothing without the United States, and without the United States ironclad commitment.
Bart, let me give Amy a chance to ask a question. I think she was teed up a minute ago. Amy, you're okay. You're good.
Sure, but only if time allows.
We
Yep.
should have a minute or two.
Okay. So thank you. Great talk. I want to go back to some of your overarching thoughts about the EU. And I tend to be an optimist by nature, but I'm not finding a lot of reasons for optimism. For many of the reasons you mentioned, the lack of leadership, right? The EU has worked best. You've seen, deepening and enhanced coordination when Germany and France have played a robust leadership role. But the other big items on the EU's agenda, tackling climate and border security, and it seems to me the recent elections send a really clear message on those things, that the EU really overshot on what it was trying to accomplish with climate goals, and still the kind of echoes of the large flows of migration. So it seems to me Ukraine is maybe the thing sort of holding Europe together in a perverse way. And I wondered if maybe you could end with another reason for optimism, that the EU will hang together, and
Yeah.
that we'll kind of get past this moment.
No, look, it's a great question. I'm an optimist by nature as well, although with the gray Brussels sky that are coming up for the next several months, sometimes you do need to find those sources of optimism. Look, I think it's sort of like Churchill's line about democracy, that the EU is the worst system of government except for Europe, except for all the other forms that have been tried. And look, the EU way of doing things, of doing politics, is certainly much better than France and Germany fighting it out on the battlefield, or all the violence and conflicts that Europe has gone through for centuries. And it is remarkable that for all the complexity, all the veto players, all the challenges, they make decisions, they approve budgets, they get money out. And so, all that is great. They get laws approved. They pass landmark EU AI Act. So they can still get business done. But I don't want to sugarcoat the difficulties that they are facing in Ukraine, and the open question mark that is taking place now with the US elections. And if it's Trump, then it's going to be, a pretty tough slog. In the words of another famous writer, Thomas Hobbes, life is going to be nasty and brutish and grim in Europe for the foreseeable future, because at a certain point, it's going to be difficult to make take care of some of these challenges. And we have to recall that, for all of our massive resources, all the manpower, money, military might, we were not successful in Afghanistan. Iraq was sort of sort of medium case outcome. Libya, not super successful. Syria likewise. And so we haven't had too many success stories. Ukraine is a huge challenge for Europe. I hope Europe and the West prevail and the Ukrainians prevail. But, the Russians could win as well. And if Trump is in office, that probability, unfortunately, may be a little bit higher. But, we are also going to be optimistic and trying to figure out ways to move forward if that happens. And if it's a Kamala Harris administration, which I hope it is, then things will be a little bit easier. So let me end here, and thank you again for your time. And I hope we can reconvene at some point in the future and see how some of these predictions have turned out, and what the new challenges will be.
Bart, Szewczyk, thank you very much. We really enjoyed having you, and we do hope to see you again. And thank you,
Thank you,
Bart.
Thank you.
Larry, for getting us
Thank
together.
you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Goodbye.
To our audience.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
If anybody's interested, there was a good piece on NPR last week about German artillery manufacturing. If anybody is interested, it dovetails with what he was saying about how slow and far behind the Germans are in trying to meet the needs of the military. And that may explain why they're having to go to Australia to get. There's also a question of compatibility with the German manufactured armaments
Right.
with the rest of the equipment that NATO is using.
In that regard, I
You
would
read a
like
lot
to
about that.
do
Yeah.
a session on military readiness by the US and our allies, because you keep hearing positives and, we can blow up the world. Well, if the bombs are still working, I mean, the discussions all over, not that I want to blow up the world, but discussions all over the place. So may I go ahead and investigate options there?
Sure, go
Speakers.
ahead.
Yes.
Okay, we're
Yeah.
still online, so let's, so anyway, I do want to, talk about our next program, which is gonna be on November 4th. We have a great speaker, Peter Nussler, who is with the US State Department. He was stationed in the Middle East and is now in Poland and will be speaking on balancing values and interest. This is a talk I think that is really timely, as I think many of us are questioning how the US can say one thing and do something else. So please tune in. That's going to be a very good, I think, discussion that we can all have together. So see you on November 4th. Bye.
Thank you,
Right,
June.
thank you, June.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.